So where we left off was the Chinese Civil War. So Kershank's government is corrupt, and because it's corrupt, communism can take root. The U.S. government money that we're giving to him, he is using it for his palaces, and he's kind of, when he's doing this, he's really alienating his supporters who were the middle class citygoers, so the urban middle class. When you look at Mao, Mao is getting a lot of his support from the rural peasants because Mao is promising a land reform. So when you look at the Chinese Civil War, the roots is just a disagreement in how the government should actually be helping the people. And this is kind of how communism normally spreads through these areas. So during the World War II, Mao had built up considerable amount of communist support. And he's using it against Kershank. The U.S. were supporting Kershank, but at the same time we try and mediate some sort of agreement between Kershank and Mao, but we fell miserably in the job. So what we're going to see is that a civil war is going to break out between the democracy and the communists. So Kershank is going to have to flee because he doesn't have the support of the middle class urbanites. And the peasants have actually supported Mao, and there's a whole lot of peasants in China, and Mao's promised them big land reforms, which is what they need. So Kershank and his army and his people, 2 million, have to go ahead and abandon China, and they go to Taiwan. When they're in Taiwan, they're going to form this new Republic of China. So the question that historians asked is, like, who actually lost China? Truman writes this famous document. It's called the White Paper. And in the White Paper, what President Truman says is that Kershank is the reason why China fell to communism. So when you look at this, if you get a DBQ question on communism in Southeast Asia or the spreading of communism, you might want to add in Truman's White Paper because that's a primary source. And remember, in a DBQ, you always have to add one document. I know it's hard, but just add it. Explain why you add it, why it would benefit the paper, and then you get a point. Anything to get a point. All right, so the new China. So now that communism has fallen, our communism has taken over China, and the democracy has fallen, what you see is that China's Communist Party would like to go ahead and start restoring their territorial integrity and influence of imperial China. Now, of course, they're not going back with the emperor, but what they would like to do is kind of reestablish the old order of where China kind of dominated. And they're going to do a pretty good job, like in Manchuria, and then like for 100 years, China hadn't really been in control of Tibet, but they get control of it again. Mao really fails, though, in getting control of Korea and Taiwan, and the reason why Taiwan's not going to fall under his control is because the Republic of China is there. Kershank is there, and that's where he's kind of waiting. He doesn't get Vietnam either. What particularly interested Mao was Korea and Vietnam. These were two areas that he felt sure communism could exert its power, and maybe it would go ahead and fall to communism. So eventually we get this Korean War, and the Korean War is another civil war that's going on here in Asia. So after World War II, Japan was defeated, and remember, Japan had conquered Korea, conquered it a long time ago, and had really been exerting all its influence, like 1905. And so Korea, what you're going to see is that the Soviet army, here is the Soviet Union, it presses down into the northern part of Korea, and it kind of, stays here. And where they're going, they, hand out pamphlets about how great communism is. And so after World War II is over, we go ahead and we divide Korea into two occupation zones. So North Korea is going to be a Soviet Union backed zone, and then South Korea is going to be a democracy backed zone. And so we call this the 38th parallel. So this 38th parallel divides the country. What you're going to notice about the Cold War is a lot of times our solution to problems is dividing countries. We'll divide Vietnam, we'll divide Korea, we'll divide Germany. And if you notice, we always have conflicts where we divide. We'll have the whole Berlin Wall, the Berlin Airlift. With Germany and Korea, we have the Korean War. With Vietnam, we'll have the Vietnam War. I mean, it might not be a good policy to follow about dividing countries. Because remember, a divided country doesn't mean that these people are not similar. It's the same thing with the American Civil War. So the North, they are Northerners. And so the South, they're Southerners. But they're still Americans. And so that's the issue when you start dividing countries, is that you share a common heritage, you share a common culture. So anytime you divide, you're probably going to start seeing some issues developing, and this is really what's going to happen. So the two separate governments, they evolved. The North is going to fall to communism, and then you're going to get an anti-communist South. In June 1950, North Korea decides that it's time to invade South Korea and reunite the Koreas, and it seems like they have support of Joseph Stalin. So Truman, who doesn't like Stalin and hasn't been liking him since he's become president, he doesn't trust him. Stalin doesn't like Truman either. Remember, we talked about this in the beginning part. Truman is going to respond with the approval of the United Nations Security Council with a United Nations force. So we are going to go into Korea, into South Korea, and push the North Koreans out. The North Koreans, however, are going to push all the way, they push a good portion in here, and then we're going to push them all the way back to that 38th parallel. So here's the progression of the Korean War. So here's the beginning, 1950. 1950 September, you can see that North Korea has really pushed all the way almost to the shorelines, and so South Korea looks like it is being taken over by the communist North. Then what we're going to do by November of that year, 1950, is we're going to push the North Koreans all the way up, almost into Manchuria and the USSR. Then what's going to happen is that by 1953, we're going to go ahead and decide that the original agreement, that 38th parallel, is the appropriate dividing line between North and South Korea. So in the United Nations, forces are going to be under General Douglas MacArthur. Remember, he's from World War II with his island hopping strategy that wins the Japanese theater of war. He's also famous for President Hoover's mistake with the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans who marched on Washington during the Great Depression because they would like to go ahead and have their bonus. That's why they're called the Bonus Army early. And General MacArthur exceeds his orders and fires on, World War I veterans. And you should never shoot non-armed people, and you probably shouldn't shoot anyone, but he does it anyway. So MacArthur's kind of a loose cannon at times, and so MacArthur is going to go to the Yalu River and the border between North Korea and China. And what we're going to start seeing is the Chinese are getting a little worried because, MacArthur's kind of a loose cannon. And so what the Chinese are going to do is they're going to volunteer to enter the war. And when they volunteer, it's always nice whenever you see volunteers in quotation. When they volunteer to join the war, what's going to end up happening is it starts to really kind of change the war. And we're starting to see a war that maybe North Korea could win. So eventually that's going to stop. And MacArthur's going to get in a lot of trouble during the war because he's going to advocate that what we should do is what the United States should do is drop the atomic bomb on North Korea, but also invade communist China and just go ahead and end that right then and there. Because he does this and he does it in the newspapers and the media, he's going to be fired and released from his generalship in the Korean War. So you never criticize the President of the United States when you're an officer or when you're in the Army, period. You're not supposed to. That's your commander-in-chief. So eventually we'll get this 38th parallel reestablished. Now, Chinese motives for intervening in Korea. So why did the Chinese volunteer to help out North Korea? Mao is convinced that a revolutionary wave is going to spread throughout Asia. He believes in his heart that communism is just going to go all over Asia, and China will be the lead of this revolutionary wave. He also feared that a hostile United States forces would be stationed on China's frontier. And remember, the United States does have a military base in Seoul, Korea. And we have another military base there, too, because the Korean War ends with an armistice, a ceasefire. It doesn't end really with a treaty. We just kind of say the 38th parallel is the 38th parallel. North Korea, you stay there. South Korea, we're going to be here. And you have this nice big wall. And on this great big wall, you have U.S. forces and Korean forces, North Korean and South Korean forces just kind of facing each other. They're called like mirrors. You just watch the other guy, make sure he doesn't pull the trigger, and you don't pull the trigger so you don't have any fence line problems. So that's kind of how we saw the Korean War. It's just an armistice, And Korea sometimes is called the Forgotten War, and it's kind of called the Forgotten War because it kind of drags out. It kind of becomes a stalemate during the war. And it's not Truman who ends the war. It's President Dwight D. Eisenhower who will end the war. We like Ike. Ike will get back. He'll get into the presidency in 1950. And he'll become the president then because he was a hero from World War II. He gets voted in. People like him. And his goal is to end this Korean War. So China becomes pretty isolated except for the Soviet Union. So we get a conflict in Indochina. Indochina is Vietnam. Okay, so Vietnam had been occupied by the Japanese during World War II because remember, Japan is conquering all these nice island nations to give it like a nice 360-degree radius support. And that's why we do the island hopping, taking the weaker islands to get to the mainland of Japan. So Vietnam had been conquered by Japan. In 1946, the Civil War is going to break out in Vietnam, and it's between the returning French, so the French who had owned Indochina, that imperialistic time, and Ho Chi Minh, who's a communist, is going to kind of lead the Vietnamese force. So you're going to get, and eventually become the Viet Cong army, but what you're going to get is the imperial power of France battling this rebel leader, Ho Chi Minh. By the early 1950s, the Civil War in Vietnam, in Indochina, had become part of the Cold War. So China is going to support Ho Chi Minh because he's a communist and he's the little rebel leader. And the United States is going to support the French. I mean, we supported them during World War II. I mean, we supported them during World War I. They supported us during the American Revolutionary War. I mean, we just have this kind of old history together. They're democracy, we're a democracy. It kind of works that way. So what we decide is going to happen with Indochina is the Geneva Peace Conference. And sometimes you'll see this referred to as the Geneva Accords. So the Geneva Peace Conference in 1954, the French are going to tire of fighting this dirty war. They're tired of fighting because Ho Chi Minh does not fight like in battle lines or strategies. I mean, Ho Chi Minh is a guerrilla warfare fighter. And we'll know that when we actually go, when the United States enters the Vietnam War in the 60s, he does not fight like a regular army. He uses guerrilla warfare tactics. So they build like all these nice tunnels in Vietnam, and then they just pop up like gophers, shoot at you, pop back down in the holes. I mean, and this is why Vietnam, with its jungles, was really hard for American soldiers and any of the soldiers that fought in the Vietnam War to accompany themselves, to get accustomed with. So at the Geneva Peace Conference, what we decided to do is to go ahead and divide divide French Indochina, which is going to be Vietnam, by the 17th parallel. So again, you divide these countries and you have problems. So we're going to divide it, and the Northern Democratic Republic, which is really a communist, North Vietnam will become communist, and then the non-communist South is going to become the Republic of Vietnam. So you're going to have a North Vietnam communist by Ho Chi Minh, and then you're going to have a Southern Vietnam or South Vietnam, which is going to be a republic, a democracy. The conflict is going to result in increasing tensions between China and the United States. And when we're eventually going to end trade with China, and that will get back open when President Nixon becomes the president, because he's going to have this policy of détente, which is an easing of tensions, of Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, but he's also going to ease tensions with other communist nations. And by the 1970s, America's economy is terrible. We have this thing called stagflation, and because the economy is so terrible, we're going to want to open up trade with China to get goods, to sell goods, and that's why we'll kind of also ease tensions. So from confrontation to coexistence. In the 1950s, we're going to see the world kind of opening up to this nuclear catastrophe, because nuclear weapons have been created. And when it's created, Eisenhower is going to have this policy called brinkmanship. And brinkmanship means that the United States and other countries are constantly on the brink of nuclear war. And so what brinkmanship basically says is it's okay to threaten nuclear war to get countries to back down. During the 1950s, you see big countries reducing their military forces and just building up their nukes, because why send in foot soldiers who could possibly die when you could just nuke a place and just end the war right then and there? So we get this fear of a nuclear fallout or a nuclear catastrophe coming, but it's going to end because somehow people are going to start seeing this sanity that maybe you shouldn't use nukes against people. And I'm going to stop here. We'll go on to another part.